Hi, David here with Independence Live. I've got Professor John Robertson in the studio with me this evening. So, John Robertson, how are you?
I'm well, thanks very much for having me here.
It's a great pleasure and a great privilege as well.
No.
You've been quite taken with Jimi Hendrix.
I have.
You like Jimmy?
I'm a big fan of Jimi Hendrix.
With his Yes badge.
The best cover ever along the Watchtower, I think. The best cover of any song along the Watchtower, yeah?
Was that originally someone else's?
Well, Bob Dylan, young man.
Sorry, I'm showing my age. I'm showing my age.
The lack of it.
I'm showing your age as well, actually.
Which is good.
Did he wear a Yes badge when you saw him back in 1960?
I think he was. I don't think he required a Yes badge because I think he was saying yes to the world, really, pretty much about everything. Jimi Hendrix then, it was all experiences. So I'd imagine he would have been on our side, I'm sure.
He is on our side. He's sitting there with his Yes badge on.
Right. Okay.
So John Robertson, you're very famous now in terms of the Yes campaign, particularly because one of the key issues within the Yes campaign was the bias of the media machine, and particularly the BBC. And of course, you did a report on the BBC which suggested that perhaps they were not 100% impartial.
No, I think, in some ways I wasn't surprised.
Yeah.
The BBC is a public service broadcaster and therefore has a responsibility to the public, but it's paid for by taxation, and decisions are made by a board which is appointed by government. So that a national broadcaster would be impartial in the context of major constitutional change would have been naive to think that would have happened anyway. What surprised me more was in the latter stages the naked imbalance that they adopted in the final stages, when as Alex Salmond said recently, when they actually delivered the no vote, pretty much. I think the BBC played a huge part in that in the latter stages. In the early stages when I did my research, it was more subtle, a bit more nuanced, as they say. Mm-hmm. But in some ways, it's just not surprising. You imagine in Russia and the state broadcaster and over Crimea's independence. Mm-hmm. If it was only 3-2 bias, you'd think, oh, that's not bad. Quite good for Crimea.
So the findings of the study, we discussed this with Blair Jenkins 2 weeks ago, was that the ratio was 3-2 in terms of positive to negative. Yeah. Is that right? Which produced a very subtle bias, which is quite difficult to identify without an analytical study.
Yeah. I mean, the 3-2 ratio was picked up by some people as at last evidence. The minute you start to use numbers, people think, we've got scientific evidence here with numbers. Now, a 3-2 ratio is not very strong. And I didn't think that was the big message from the research, but that's the one that was picked up on, because people like these simple messages of numbers. I was much more interested in other aspects of the research. I mean, the demonising of the First Minister, which 2 years later we hear a former governor of the BBC, Sir, I've forgotten his name now, Bland. Sir Christopher Bland. Sir Christopher Bland says that Alex Salmond was paranoid about this. Now, I don't think there was any doubt that Alex Salmond was demonised. And there was a tendency which started 2 years ago to identify or to conflate the Yes campaign with his personal wishes. Yeah. Now, Sir Christopher Bland suggests that it's paranoid to suggest that happened, and that it was just the way journalists behave. But no other journalist had that experience, no other politician had the experience. You see, the opportunities with Alistair Darling or with Joanne Lamont, the opportunities to demonise them and to say that it's Joanne Lamont wants this and it's been a slap in the face for Joanne Lamont because she doesn't get this and so on. Yeah. That didn't happen. And if it had been even, then there would have been some demonising of Alex Salmond and demonising of Joanne Lamont. Yeah. But it only happened the one way.
Indeed. I've got a quote here, which is, what you really want in media is ostensible diversity, which conceals actual uniformity. So there was a bit of a mix and a mash throughout the whole thing. I'm not going to. Well, I should tell you who that quote is from, but that unfortunately is far too often quoted in all of this. That's Joseph Goebbels.
They say when you mention Hitler, you've lost the argument. I don't know whether when you mention Goebbels, you've lost the argument.
Well, the unfortunate thing is that that name crops up an awful lot when it comes to how media has mastered the control of the populations on behalf of corporations.
No, it's a reasonable quote
Rich.
because Goebbels took his inspiration from the advertising industry in the United States, and the leading figure there, whose name has gone right out of my head, was a relative of Freud.
Oh,
and
Bernays, Edward
yes,
Bernays.
Bernays. So Goebbels was hugely influenced by Bernays.
Yeah.
So the idea that propaganda is something that doesn't really appear is very naive, because I think propaganda is always propaganda in the United States and in Britain during the Second World War. Propaganda was a good word. People thought it was good to propagandize so that you got the message across and you kept the population together. You got solidarity. You got a population that supported the war effort. And it's easy to look back to World War II and think that was a good thing. But when that continues into more liberal times and more modern times, then you start to see propaganda for what it is, which is a process which is designed to deceive the majority.
Indeed.
And in capitalism, it's a subtle way of control. In the Soviet Union and in Nazi Germany, everybody knew they couldn't trust the media. And so the media propaganda was ineffective because everybody knew it couldn't be trusted. In the West, propaganda has been very successful because propaganda has been presented in a way that persuades people that it's free will and that it's democracy and choice. And as we know from people like Herman and Chomsky, we know that that's the way Western democracies operate. They provide a way of persuading the population that actually they're indulging in free will, when actually a great deal of the time they're being influenced very strongly by media messages.
I've got another quote, which
right.
you were just leading up to it there. The quote is, "They could be made to accept the most flagrant violations of reality, and they were not sufficiently interested in public events to notice what was happening." So it's George Orwell from 1984, which was written in 1948.
Yes.
Which is around about the time of Edward Bernays.
Yes.
So the United States, of course, is a more extreme case, but within Britain we certainly have a corporatocracy. What I mean by that is that we don't have democracy as we normally understand it. The corporations are already in the chamber.
Yes.
And they're performing on behalf of those who want to make the most money out of society.
Yeah.
And the media, and we could also call it a mediocracy, are the intermediary between government and population. The media, which is supposed to check political abuse, is now part of political abuse.
Yes, I mean, I think it's been a long-standing.
I mean, okay, I was just going to say, do you think that we're now in a situation where we are in a mediocracy?
I mean, I hadn't heard that one before, and I think it's a good one. And I think also it's a kleptocracy as well, in that the corporations are largely stealing from the rest of the population through taxation or avoidance of taxation. Yeah. I would say what's happening in the UK is a continuation of what's been happening for some time, really since the end of the deal that the end of World War II brought, the promise of a land fit for heroes and the promise of a welfare state and so on, which began to crumble under Thatcher and Reagan in the US in the late 70s. And from then on, we've got this gradual erosion of the conditions of working people and the gradual enrichment of a small elite. And whether you call it a kleptocracy, an oligarchy, or whatever, it's definitely a worsening situation. When I was still in university in the 70s, I used to go and see theatre shows by the 784 Company. The 784 Company were named after the ratio of inequality, which was 7% of the population who owned 84% of the wealth.
That's right.
Now, of course, they'd have to be the 199 Company. We start to sound more like an ice cream than a theatre company, the 199.
Yep.
So, I mean, the way it operates is, I mean, the ideas that I spout are not mine. I take just about everything I know from Noam Chomsky and Noam Chomsky's explanation of the corrupt relationship between media and power. And that what you have in every country is the absence of the need for a conspiracy. Conspiracy is not required. You have people who have attended the same kind of school, the same university, who mix in the same social circles, live in the same areas, go to the same social events and the same holidays, and they're part of an interlocking elite. So the media elite went to the same schools, same universities as the industrial elite or the military elite and so on. And they mix socially. And they don't get together and conspire, despite what Blair said last week.
Yeah.
They don't need to conspire, they act in their own interests.
Yeah.
And their own interests are the interests of that elite.
Indeed. So just following that theme, what was the atmosphere amongst other academics towards the work, the revelations which you'd produced?
Yes, well, that was quite a surprise at first, and I didn't realise it was a surprise first because the surprise was silence. When I published the research, I'd actually sent it to a journal over the Christmas holidays, and the journal had said that they wouldn't release it until after the referendum. Okay. And I thought, no, this needs to be talked about before the referendum. So I sent it to Newsnet Scotland. Newsnet Scotland published it, and it went viral, and it had 10,000 hits a day. Yeah. And Frankie Boyle retweeted it, and then Irvin Welsh retweeted it. I'm starting to think, is there a pattern there in the kind of people who identify with me, Irvin Welsh and Frankie Boyle? Foul-mouthed, perhaps.
You could do worse.
Yeah, I could do worse. Yep. What I didn't notice at first, because the BBC had complained about me, and I noticed the negative attention. I didn't notice that none of my peer group were supporting me. None of them now, whether they agreed with my research or not, they should have supported my freedom to write this and not to be punished by the BBC and bullied by the BBC. No single professor of media, politics, or economics, or any relevant discipline, not one broke ranks to say that they disagreed with the BBC.
Is this because the people are within a sort of a career bubble, which they fear popping out of?
Yeah.
Is this something that sort of overrides, critical thinking?
Well, I think they understand. I think they understand too well. I think you would have thought some would have been, partly because of my age. I'm a bit fearless about all of this because I think, well, if they want to get me, I'll just retire. Yeah. And then I can understand why a younger academic might think, because Noam Chomsky is not popular in academia because Noam Chomsky condemns career academics for being, as you described it, more interested in their career than in the consequences for wider society. Yeah. Now, historically, professors were supposed to be engaged. Like Chomsky and like Edward Said, they were supposed to be public intellectuals. And universities were supposed to give them the freedom to do that. And a huge swathe of Scottish academics have chosen to sit on their hands, either through fear, sometimes through, of course, links with the Labour Party.
Oh, yeah.
And that was like a huge disappointment to me. But colleagues on the Ayr campus were helpful. Yeah. And my principal made it clear he was supporting academic freedom. Mm-hmm. And he was actually in favour of no, but he supported at least the idea.
Indeed, okay. Did you follow on and do the second year study?
No, I didn't. I planned to do the second year, and the second year would have been more important in some ways. But in March, I was commissioned by Newsnet Scotland, so this becomes partial and very, very obviously partisan. Mm-hmm. I was asked by them to do a study of Good Morning Scotland because they thought Good Morning Scotland was affecting a quite important intellectual elite in Scottish society, professionals and so on. And that research report I did, and it was put up on Newsnet Scotland. It got hardly any attention because it didn't have a magic ratio in it. It had lots of detail of things that James Naughtie had said that I disagreed with and so on. Okay. So that took me off it. And then at the end of that period, I decided to come out of the closet, as I said earlier, and I joined the Yes campaign in Ayr. And that was a wonderful experience. Absolutely wonderful experience. So I'm glad, and I don't see why professors have to be held back.
No.
I did my research, I did it as honestly as I could, I tried to do it as scientifically as I could, but then I got to a point where I thought, I'm in the world too, and so I thought I'll come out and be involved.
Okay. Well, we spoke to Blair Jenkins 2 weeks ago.
Yes,
he was here in the studio. And he did say, I did put your research findings to Blair.
I saw that.
And he had a chance to comment. It may be that Blair Jenkins, he's a very nice man.
Oh, sure.
But he's very good at okay, I'm going to put the points that the responses that Blair gave me, and I'll allow you to respond. Okay, so the first point was on broadcasting. Apparently, according to Blair Jenkins, within the overall Yes campaign, broadcasting remained a minor theme. A minor theme.
Yeah.
As far as, just from a personal level, I could see it going on around me within the arguments and what was visible. This was the biggest gripe.
I was astonished by the interview, and it wasn't. And Blair had said some of the same things in another context, and I found it quite remarkable. And Alex Salmon's rather more direct comments recently make me wonder just where Blair Jenkins stands in all of this. I was angered by some of the things. He seemed almost to be there to be an apologist for the BBC and to kind of forgive the BBC, almost as if he were Nelson Mandela, you know, coming along and we're okay, we realise you were just normal human beings, you did your best. I think the media part of it, the wider media part of it, the social media part of it, the huge anger about the BBC's performance throughout that, I think was a big story. It was clearly a big story. He's right that the grassroots thing was very important. I don't deny that. That was massively important. But I think it's wholly wrong that the media story wasn't important. And I think he was saying that because I think he wants to deflect from that. And I don't know why that is. It's maybe some residual loyalty to people that Blair Jenkins is, you know, has connections with the media before the referendum.
Yes.
And I thought he was very soft on the BBC, very soft indeed.
Diplomatic, that was the word that I was looking for there. I felt that when I was talking to Blair Jenkins that he was being very diplomatic. He didn't want to give anyone a hard time, because the fact is that there are people, many people who work for the BBC who are good, honest journalists, good, honest workers and technicians as well, who did not agree with the editorial line, but ultimately the BBC was in the control of the elite and was doing their bidding. The final output was an anti-Scottish, anti-Yes campaign propagandist output. Yeah, I agree.
And excessively so in the last few weeks.
Indeed. The protests that we saw outside the Pacific Quay were there for a reason. The thousands of people who came, sometimes in the rain, on, I can't remember how many individual occasions.
I think there were 4 at least.
At least 4, and I think there have been a couple subsequently, which one was in Glasgow Green, but you know, there were 4 big ones, definitely. I spoke to George Monbiot, or George Monbiot, what do we call him?
I don't know how to say his name.
I think in posh media they say, oh, George Monbiot is on the line, but I think George Monbiot he was in the BBC, Guardian, probably one of the leading journalists in Britain. And he explained very well that the BBC was disciplined by Thatcher. The BBC were producing, what was the, sorry, it's escaped my mind. There was a documentary that was made in the 80s about Thatcher's something or other. Right.
I don't know that.
Oh, no, okay, it doesn't matter. And it was after that Thatcher took away any of the edginess from the Beeb. They were strongly brought into line.
Yes.
And from this point forward, they've pretty much towed a line which is set from Westminster.
And they were pulled in, obviously, by Alistair Campbell and Tony Blair over the Iraq War, and accused of not supporting the government on the Iraq War. The irony is that they actually were supporting, because people did studies at the time.
Yes. And
that only Channel 4 News came out as critical. BBC were clearly weren't supportive enough for Alistair Campbell, who presumably had one of his swearing fits over it. But the BBC have been, I suppose you might say, emasculated in the period from Thatcher till today. Yeah. And there has been no attempt to deal with that. I'm trying to avoid the obvious metaphors here for dealing with emasculation, how you would give them new ones.
Well, I think Jonathan Shafi, who we also spoke to, said when you have control over someone's job, you have control over someone.
Yes.
Or words to that effect, anyway.
Yeah. Should I have said that?
It's all right. You're on new media. So,
right. Okay.
Independence Live. That's how we roll. So Blair Jenkins, he's not sure if you're the man to produce the next phase of research, but I think what he was saying there is that you've taken part within the Yes campaign, so therefore your work could be seen as biased.
Yes,
I think he was being fair and diplomatic.
But the logical is that a corollary of that? Corollary? I can't remember what the word is even. The logical consequence of that reasoning is that then you employ a no sympathiser, because I don't believe there are any wholly impartial people in this.
Okay.
I don't think you find anyone. I did laugh when he said it shouldn't be me, and I'm quite happy for it not to be me. I've got a book to write just now about it all. There were so many things that Blair said that I could have taken offence with, but I didn't too much.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I was sitting. I had to hold myself back. No, sorry.
Well, thank you.
The BBC is a formal complaint system. That was the bit where I did
That was
actually.
great, yeah. That was great.
The cat nearly attacked me at that point. Yeah, the BBC had a formal complaint system. So if I remember correctly, you'd be tearing your hair out and watching Newsnight or something like that, and you would send the angriest but most extremely well structured and detailed complaint to the BBC. About how it was exactly how it was in breach of its charter. And the BBC would say, we're the BBC, we've had a look at the BBC, and the BBC have done nothing wrong. Thank you very much, goodbye.
Yes. That was a sharp intake of breath when he expressed in those reassuring terms that if you were unhappy with the BBC, then there was a mechanism for complaint, and it would be dealt with. It would be dealt with. Now, over the last 2 years, I've had lots of people who had read my research, and for whatever reason, because they read my research, they thought, hey, he'll want to know about my complaint to the BBC. And so, about 40 people have written sometimes with sheafs of paper of the exchange they've had with the BBC, because they themselves had spotted bias. And are genuinely, I shouldn't joke about this, genuinely really pleased to see all of these. But every single one was dissatisfied by the response, because as you put it there yourself, the BBC said, We've got a charter that says we're impartial, therefore we must be impartial, therefore we were impartial.
Yes.
Rather than actually defending the case ever. It's quite funny, I think I remember that the complaints department is in Darlington.
Is
which
it?
I remember thinking was quite ironic given our experience with Mr. Darling.
Yes, okay.
No connection, I'm sure. But.
No. Okay. Now, this is an interesting point. A conspiracy would involve far too many people. But the thing is about conspiracy is that, and we're not going to get into conspiracies, by the way, but conspiracies always actually involve a very few people because that's how they work. A very few people stitch it all up and everybody else just sort of doesn't realise what's going on. Or at least the job has been controlled by someone, so that it's within their interest just to keep going.
It was very interesting you brought up the conspiracy thing. This happens all the time. When you put forward the ideas of Noam Chomsky about how media interlock and how they control the messages, people say, oh, that's a conspiracy theory. Are you saying they all meet together in a room and stir a cauldron and say, let's do down the people with our messages? It doesn't. But you're right, there can be elements of conspiracy. It could be the case. Let's say, for example, the top 4 people in BBC Scotland, let's say they all really like the Labour Party. Just a suggestion, which may be true. And let's say even one of them's married into the Labour Party. And they maybe talk to each other and maybe they do conspire in a way. Yeah. But that wouldn't be enough. He's right, that wouldn't be enough. It takes a system in which those below them in the system sense their presence and sense their desires. And so the junior journalist works for the journalist above, sensing what that journalist wants, and they sense what the editor wants. And so without anyone being told what to do, and the chair of the NUJ was on Derek Bateman's television broadcast recently, and he said he'd spoken to people in the BBC and none had ever been told what to write. And he thought, well, that was an answer to it, therefore there was no bias, there was no domination. But it's not required. These people choose themselves what to write in the context of what they think they are wanted for. And so they work towards the level above. Yeah. But Blair set up the conspiracy theory, and he knows that nobody's saying it was a conspiracy. He knows I wasn't saying it was a conspiracy. He set it up as what's known as a straw man, said, here's what these people are saying, isn't it ridiculous? Knock it over. But it wasn't what we were saying. So that made me more angry than anything else, his conspiracy line.
Okay. Well, Alex Salmond was, this is the way that in which the message was framed, was that Alex Salmond wants, the leader of the Yes campaign, Alex Salmond, wants.
Yes.
Now, Alex Salmond was not the leader of the Yes campaign, which was a factual error, which came up time and time again. Do you remember if you have a figure on how many times that deliberate mistake was made?
And well, in the first year, it was something. In the first year, it was the order of about 40 times. But the important, it wasn't a lot in that period. But the important thing was that 40 times was more than the 0 applied to Joanne Lamont or Darling.
Yeah, that's a huge amount, though. 40.
40 to 0, and the point is, it was 40 to 0.
Yeah.
On the 11th of September, I just did one night, 11th September. That was the day the three big chiefs arrived. The three stooges, as they were sometimes called. Yeah. The BBC made 14 references to Salmond and none to the Yes campaign in that one show, one night on BBC. Yeah. So I mean, for them to, again going back to the former governor Sir Christopher Bland. For him to say Alex Salmond is being paranoid, and so is anyone else who says that Salmond was being demonised, is just nonsense. He clearly was. The numbers are there.
That was when the Three Stooges came up. That was when the BBC arrived in Glasgow, wasn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
That wonderful satirical moment when the guy with the Star Wars music appeared. Yes.
Young Matt Lygate. I was actually speaking to him on Monday evening, and he told me that the BBC were desperate to get in touch with him about that.
Yeah.
But he refused to speak to them on the basis that when the Yes campaign were out, the BBC were nowhere. The BBC only arrived when these leaders, the Imperial Masters, more or less said, right, we're coming, you must come. So he refused to speak to the BBC on that basis. I told me a few more stories as well, but we've not got time.
No, sure.
So I'll just finish with what Blair, a quotation from Blair. The essence is not what happened in the media, it's what happened on the ground and around the country. Now, this was a bit of it was a big debate that was happening within the Yes campaign, just how important is the media. Of course, what we did on the ground, going door to door, speaking to people in the street, person to person, peer to peer, and across social media. But the fact is that mainstream media permeated right into the homes of virtually every single person, particularly certain demographics.
Yeah. I think much of he's entirely right that the grassroots movement and the activity in social media were one of the most wonderful demonstrations of democracy in the history of Western democracy. I think Scotland was at that time a model for democratic engagement by a population. A huge amount to be proud of in terms of what happened there. And I was hugely impressed by the people I met on Facebook who were sending me articles they'd spotted, about how the Daily Express told the story one day and how they told it in Scotland differently.
Yes.
These sort of little bits of evidence all the time.
Yeah.
These were people, and the last protest meeting which was called off at South Pacific Key, I was actually going to give the whole Yes campaign an honorary degree in propaganda studies. I took a gown with me.
Yeah.
I was in the Horseshoe Bar before it and was ready for it, and then we got there and it was pouring with rain. But I think that a population was educated in politics in a way beyond most other countries.
Okay, I'm going to just read off a few BBC headlines. Now, you might recognise these, viewers at home might recognise these. Craig Murray, the former British ambassador to Uzbekistan, who's now standing as an SNP.
Hopefully. Is he definitely standing?
I think so.
He intends to, yeah.
I think there is an intention. In one of his speeches, he read off these BBC headlines, so they're all genuine. Scottish independence. Pensions shortfall warning. UK Treasury. Warning about SNP plan for currency after independence. Scottish independence. Warning over weakened military. Scottish independence. Luxembourg warns against. Pattern emerging here.
Yes.
Scottish independence. Barroso warning on EU membership. Scottish independence. Havoc warning. Scottish independence. Michael Moore issues warning. Scottish independence. Border checks. Warning from Home Office. Warning for SNP over renewable energy after independence.
Sure.
Because, of course, after independence, the weather changes and the seas dry up.
You didn't mention the alien attacks.
No.
The RAF will not be able to defend us against
just
alien
before
attacks.
I was about to say you couldn't make this up.
No. But even Miliband said the thing about the border guards. Even Miliband, was stupid enough to...
Indeed. Now what I'm wanting to come back to here is that if the media was not as influential as has been stated, this would not have had the impact. I mean, it's nonsense. It really, and it builds and it builds and it builds. That's the kind of the reason for reading through the list. It just becomes funny. But the fact is that you were speaking to people, real people, who had genuine concerns that Luxembourg was warning against Scottish independence. Sorry, no, they weren't. They had genuine concerns over the currency, for example, and things like the currency is the basis of an economy. Lies were being carried. That is a factually incorrect statement, yet it was carried more than once by the BBC, by their own journalists.
It's the only real area in which you can influence voters, and that's to send them repeated bad news about the economy.
Yeah.
Most other aspects of the campaigning in elections, there's not much evidence that actually makes any difference what you say, except in that one area, bad news about the economy. And it affects in particular the elderly. They're more likely to vote for status quo if they or for the dominant party if they think there's a threat to pensions and so on. And there's some evidence that about a quarter of the no vote would have moved the other way if it hadn't been for these threats.
Yeah.
So it was stolen. You have to say it was stolen. But then, who's surprised in a lot of ways? Think of the history of the British Empire.
Indeed.
The idea that they should do something dirty.
Yeah,
Big surprise.
Okay. If you have questions for Professor John Robertson, then please make sure you use the text box at the bottom. We've got Kevin over in Hendricks Hub, a little studio through there, and he's going to be taking your questions and sending them through to us. So any questions for John Robertson? Do we have questions for John Robertson right now, or?
We've got questions.
Okay, Kevin.
Right, okay. We've got Robert Wilson. Please ask Professor Robertson to look at BBC on the whole fracking issue. I was listening to Radio 4 at 1 today, and the bias in the fracking interviews was appalling. I don't know if
That's a really good question. I've noticed actually on Facebook that a lot of the people who are really active as yes campaigners are now looking at other issues related to it, and fracking in particular. People in the Falkirk area, I've noticed a lot of people are getting very anxious about fracking.
Indeed.
And about the rights of people in Scotland to resist the imposition of fracking on them. I'm not at all surprised that the caller has observed bias on this. I don't think there's any doubt there will be, because it's fairly clear that the establishment wants the fracking to go ahead because there are profits to be made, huge profits. And if that fracking takes place, of course, in places which are heavily working class, like the areas around Grangemouth and so on, then of course then the establishment are very happy with that to happen.
And I think, just to add to that, I can't remember what the exact headline was by the BBC today, but it was something like, there is no danger from fracking, says gas company. And I should have taken a note of that. But
it's Ineos, I think, isn't it? It's Ineos in Grangemouth.
It would have been, yeah. And there is a demonstration on the 7th of December, which Independence Live will be covering, which will hopefully take a march all the way up to Ineos, but we're not 100% sure whether the police have allowed for the march to...
Well, this is one of the benefits of the Yes campaign, is that people are now aware and more likely to be active on a wide range of issues which affect the working people, or as the Tories would have us, hard-working people. And so the fact that people are now going to be active about fracking, I think, is a bonus from this, and people will be active on a whole range of issues which threaten the lives of working people.
Okay. Kevin, do you have any more questions?
I do indeed. We have one from Ross McCartney. Just a wee question. Would John consider doing another video on BBC bias on a larger scale and on more modern issues like fracking or TTIP?
Well, that's interesting. I mean, I did actually do a follow-up to the Biggest Lie video. I did a follow-up, but it's not been produced finally yet. It was based on the last days of the Yes campaign. I would be interested, and I should think of that. I'm actually busy just now writing a book about the last 2 years, and I'm on a bit of a deadline here because the publisher wants to get it out soon. But I will return to new research. The area that I'm also interested in is foreign affairs, and in particular the relationship between the rump of the British Empire and the Arab world. And I did a lot of research on that in the past. I might return to that, but I think what the gentleman has just described is clearly very important, and it's a very pressing issue. So I think I might take that hint and do something about that quite soon.
Well, I mean,
so
if you wanted to make maybe a documentary, then I'm quite sure we could help you out with...
Right. Well, I actually grew up in Grangemouth. I lived in Grangemouth for quite a long time, so I'm quite close to that. And I worked in ICI. And I remember when I worked there, that one of the engineers told me that if there was an explosion of any kind in Grangemouth, it would be a chain reaction. And the explosion would be so dramatic that we didn't worry living in Grangemouth because we would be atomised. But the people living in Stirling would have horrible burns.
Right, yeah.
So yeah, it's an interesting topic, and maybe I should think about that.
Okay. Kevin?
Okay, from Jerry Mulvaney. Can John share the conversation he had with his boss when the BBC went over his head?
What is my boss? No, my boss is I have two bosses. One was the dean, and the dean is actually the father of one of the Radical Independence campaign authors, James Foley, and Malcolm gave me a hug, which was helpful when he's been complained about, by the BBC. And then when I met my principal, he's a new principal, he's Australian, and he said I wasn't to worry because he would support my academic freedom. And after he said that, I said, listen, I'm going to this protest outside Pacific Quay. How are you okay with that? Because that's a political act. And he said, sure, a good publicity. Make sure you mention where you're employed. And then I thought, as being a bit of a chancer, this is a bit of a discussion nobody else has heard before, except live today on this show. I then said to him, how would you feel in that case if I did a Ukraine-style takeover of the building, Pacific Quay? And he said, sure, and walked away. So I don't think he really meant it. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, any more from Kevin?
Yeah.
Shall we go? Okay.
We've got Elizabeth Thompson. Wee question for the Prof. Being a Portonian, is he interested in how the media, BBC, is reporting shale gas extraction and or fracking and the involvement of INEOS?
Well, this is clearly a trend, isn't it? This is the third out of 4 questions which has been about fracking. I mean, I am interested in it. I've been a bit distracted by other things, but I have noticed, in particular Facebook friends who are in the Falkirk area, Grangemouth area, I've noticed that that's really in the centre of their minds. And I can understand that because it's an environmental threat to their living standards, their lives. So I'm definitely feeling the pressure tonight to do something about that. There's 3 votes for me spending time doing some research into the coverage of fracking. And so I think I've maybe made a promise now, haven't I?
Almost. Okay. Kevin, any more?
Yeah,
we've got
quite a few.
Popular man tonight.
Right, here goes Robert Dunsmore. Did the Prof submit to Smith Commission?
Yes, I did. I said devolve the BBC to Scottish Government control. It was quite a short submission I made. I said it was important for a democracy for the public service provider of media to be responsible to the Education and Culture Committee in Holyrood. You might remember that when I went to the Education and Culture Committee in Holyrood, 4 BBC top brass turned up and refused to answer questions because they have no responsibility to Scottish Government. Yeah. Could I just interrupt and say that if we don't get to the end of all, and maybe we'll get to the end, if we don't, I'd welcome emails from people we don't get a chance to have questions answered.
Okay.
And I'll definitely answer emails.
Okay. Kevin?
Okay, Jerry Mulvaney again. What were John's feelings when he first addressed the protesters outside Pacific Quay in June?
I was extremely nervous. Because it was a huge crowd. Yeah. It was a huge crowd, and I had to do the speech twice. The second time was better, I thought, but I really enjoyed it. I thought the crowd were fantastic. I thought they were really very impressive. I found the whole Yes campaign charming, is maybe the word for it. I've been really impressed by the engagement of a whole population, and I think what it tells you, when you see the level of conversation that there was there that day, the level of conversation online, what you clearly have is a media that underestimates its audience. The audience is far, far smarter than the BBC and STV in particular give them credit for in their news coverage.
And talking of audiences, I actually watched that and your speech from Spain. Yeah, on my tablet. So because I was working over there at the time, so that's how I kept in touch with the Yes campaign properly. Was through Independence Live.
Okay. Yeah. There were some cheeky women in the front row every time I made a mistake who corrected me, and I think that helped. I tend to react well to strong women, you know.
Oh. You do suffer from craft.
I do suffer from craft, yes. I can't remember a thing, can I say?
Yes, you can say it. Okay. Kevin, maybe one more or 2 more.
Okay, no problem. Just to let John know that somebody wants to take him to the Yes bar and buy him a right cool pint.
Great, I'll buy them one too.
Okay.
Can we go to the Horseshoe as well?
Probably, very close. Okay, we've got one from Ann T. Did John feel disappointed in the Scottish Government's support for investigation into BBC bias?
I'm not sure what that question means.
Support or lack of support?
Is it possible to, are they still online? How did BBC?
Sorry, could you just reread the question?
Yeah, it was, did John feel disappointed in the Scots Government's support for investigation into BBC bias?
I don't know if they have.
I think it's lack of support. I think
Lack of support, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that at the time, I was disappointed with the lack of support from other academics and other universities. I was disappointed in the lack of support of journalists in mainstream newspapers, none of whom would come out. I mean, even people like Ian Bell, who clearly was in favour of independence, didn't say anything at the time. I was also disappointed, but quite disappointed in the SNP, because the SNP have held back, but I understand it. The SNP have held back from direct attacks on the BBC for, I think, the reason that they don't want to scare the horses. I think they think there are votes to be lost by criticising the BBC. And that's why I think it's taken Salmon's resignation to free him up to speak rather more plainly. You may remember John Swinney on one of these panel shows where he was asked directly, had the BBC been fair? He was asked directly more than once, and he wouldn't answer. And so that, on the one hand, disappointed me that the Scottish Government didn't push for an investigation, but I think I understand. It's part of the longer strategy, the longer game.
Yeah. Okay, well, thanks very much for your questions. I'm just going to ask you about your book. So you're working on a book and it's about the last 2 years. Yeah. So what can you tell us about it?
Well, it'll be built around the research reports and some extra writing trying to explain why. And so there'll be a lot of mentions of Noam Chomsky in it as I spread the word. Noam Chomsky is the great man. I am just a vessel for Noam Chomsky's ideas. I don't claim originality in any of these ideas. Noam Chomsky is the world's greatest living public intellectual. I'm full of admiration for the man. He's a man who lives his ideas. And so I'll be using Chomsky's ideas, which are not popular with academics in Scotland.
Theory of the 1%?
Yes, the domination of the small elites, interlocking elites. Yeah. I don't know what the title will be yet. One of the things that's quite interesting, it's being published by Welsh Academic Press.
Right, I see.
Yeah,
okay.
and I said to them, because they asked me, I didn't go touting the book, they contacted me and asked me, and I said, it's interesting, it's Welsh Academic Press, and they said, yeah, we do a lot of Scottish stuff, and they mentioned 1 or 2 academic pieces, including a biography of Tommy Sheridan, in which they'd fallen out with Tommy Sheridan.
Oh, right, okay.
He doesn't like it. So they do Scottish stuff, and I said, well, that's interesting, and they said, yes, do you know why? And I said, no. I said, because the big Scottish academic publisher is Edinburgh University Press, and Edinburgh University Press are not interested in anything Scottish. They turn their noses up at it. They want to do stuff about, the Democrats in the United States or something international. So the book might be called, after Jack McConnell, might be called Thought Control in the Best Little Democracy.
Well, you know what? That would probably make a great title for a little documentary, which would help to promote the book. So let's think about working together in the future.
Sure,
I think we can we're onto something here. So we're just going to conclude now. If you'd like to speak to us about anything you'd like on Skype, then email us at liveindependence@gmail.com. Okay, so we're looking for members of the public. We're looking for just ordinary people just to come on and have a chat with us live about anything you'd like. Okay.
Can I stress again,
yes.
if anybody didn't get through, I'd really like to answer the question. And I don't care how many there are. So would they email you and then you pass them on to me, or would they email me directly? I don't.
If you'd like us to pass on emails, that's absolutely fine. Send your emails to liveindependence@gmail.com. Okay. Stay tuned to the website, okay, because things are coming up all the time. That's independencelive.net, okay? So it just remains for me to say, Professor John Robertson, thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's been a real pleasure having you on.
For me too.